A parking lot in the city of Leicester, painted lines, a handful of cars, nothing to suggest that anything remarkable lies beneath the tarmac. A battlefield outside a small English town, quiet now for over 5 centuries, where on an August afternoon in 1485, a king lost his crown and his life within the space of a few violent hours. A cabinet maker going about an ordinary week in London, unaware that inside every cell of his body he is carrying a genetic thread that reaches back, unbroken, to that same king. And in a laboratory at the University of Leicester, scientists preparing to attempt something that had never been done before, the identification of a named historical individual through DNA older than any successful case on record. What they found did not just confirm a skeleton's identity, it overturned centuries of assumptions about who this man actually was and what happened to him. Some of what the bones and the blood revealed was so at odds with the historical image everyone thought they knew that even the researchers involved were cautious about saying it out loud until the evidence was undeniable. This is a story about a king almost everyone thinks they understand, and about how the DNA told a different story than the one 400 years of legend had settled on. Once you see how this case was actually built, you will never look at the name Richard III the same way again. Now, let's talk about what the DNA actually told them. In September of 2012, archaeologists from the University of Leicester, led by Richard Buckley, excavated a site believed to be the choir of the old Greyfriars Church, buried for centuries beneath what had become a city center parking lot. What they uncovered was a male skeleton, aged somewhere between 30 and 34, with a spine that curved dramatically to one side, and a set of injuries consistent with violent death in battle. Everything about the location, the age, and the condition of the remains lined up with the historical record of Richard III, the last English king to die in combat, killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485. But archaeology alone could not close the case. A skeleton that fits a profile is not proof of an identity. To answer the question with real certainty, the team brought in Dr. Turi King, a geneticist who had spent nearly 2 decades studying how history and DNA intersect. Her task was to track down living relatives of Richard III and see whether their genetics matched what had come out of the ground. The tool she reached for first was mitochondrial DNA. Unlike most of our genetic material, mitochondrial DNA passes down a single, largely unbroken line, from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged. Think of it like a name that only gets passed down through daughters, copied forward through the centuries with almost no alteration. If you can trace an unbroken maternal line from a historical figure to someone alive today, and the genetic sequence still matches, you have found something close to an unshakable thread connecting past to present. Dr. King traced that maternal line forward from Richard's family and located 2 living descendants, including a furniture maker living an entirely ordinary life in London. When she compared their mitochondrial DNA to what had been extracted from the skeleton, the results were extraordinary. But identity was only the beginning. The DNA wouldn't just confirm who this man was, it would reveal things nobody involved in the excavation had gone looking for. The first thing the evidence settled was one of the oldest physical claims about Richard III, the idea that he was a hunchback. When researchers examined the skeleton in detail, they confirmed severe scoliosis of the thoracic spine, a genuine sideways curve significant enough to have made one shoulder visibly higher than the other, exactly as one contemporary account from his own lifetime had described. This was real. This was not invented centuries later. But the same analysis also found a gracile, essentially normal build otherwise. No fused or twisted ribcage collapsing his frame, no withered arm. The condition was there. The grotesque caricature built on top of it was not. But that finding was still relatively gentle compared to what came next, because the genetic story took a sharp and unexpected turn when the team looked at the other kind of inherited DNA, the kind passed down the male line. Where mitochondrial DNA moves quietly through mothers and daughters, the Y chromosome travels father to son, much like a surname. It is meant to move down a family tree cleanly, generation after generation, carrying the same essential signature.
Dr. King and her colleagues located male line descendants of Richard's family, including a modern relative connected through the Duke of Beaufort's lineage, and compared their Y chromosome markers to the skeletons. The DNA told a different story here too. The Y chromosome type from the skeleton did not match the modern male line at all. This did not mean the skeleton was not Richard. Genealogists and geneticists have long known that somewhere in almost any multi-generation family tree, an event occurs where the recorded father is not the biological one, whether through infidelity, adoption, or simple record error. Researchers estimate this kind of break happens at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per generation across history. Across the 19 generations separating Richard III from his modern male line relative, the odds of at least one such break occurring were high enough that the mismatch was, in the words of the research team, not particularly surprising, but it meant that somewhere in 5 centuries of recorded royal and noble lineage, a quiet, unrecorded, and now permanently untraceable break occurred in a bloodline that history had assumed was continuous and certain the entire time. Nobody will ever know exactly when or between whom. When every strand of evidence, archaeological, genetic, and statistical, was finally combined into a single formal analysis, the team calculated the probability that the Leicester skeleton was Richard III. Even using the most conservative assumptions possible, that probability came out to 99.999%. The evidence was no longer merely persuasive, it was, in the language of the researchers themselves, overwhelming. But identity was the easy part. What happened to his body told a darker story.
A separate team, led by Dr. Joe Appleby of the University of Leicester, conducted a forensic analysis of the skeleton's wounds using modern imaging technology, including whole-body CT scanning and micro-CT of the individual injury sites. Their findings, published in the Lancet, documented 11 injuries inflicted at or around the time of death, 9 of them to the skull alone. The pattern told researchers something specific. There were no defensive wounds on the arms or hands, the kind you would expect if someone were still able to raise a weapon or a shield to protect themselves, which suggested Richard was still wearing body armor at the time of the fatal blows. But the injuries to his skull were severe and unprotected, meaning he had lost his helmet, forcibly or otherwise, before those final blows landed. 2 of the wounds to the base of the skull were potentially fatal on their own. Here is where the evidence seems, at first glance, to confirm the old narrative everyone already believed, that of a hated tyrant finally getting the violent end he deserved. And there is a beat in this story where that reading looks tempting. Because the analysis found 2 additional injuries, one a cut mark on a rib, one to the pelvis, that showed signs of being inflicted after death, once his armor had already been stripped away. Researchers describe these as likely humiliation wounds, the kind of post-mortem degradation historically inflicted on defeated leaders to publicly mark their downfall. It is easy to read that detail as proof of a man so despised that even his corpse was treated with special contempt. But deeper analysis told a different story. Historians point out that this kind of post-mortem treatment, the stripping, the display, the additional wounds inflicted after death, was a documented pattern applied to defeated medieval kings generally, regardless of their individual reputation. It was a ritual of political conquest, not a referendum on one man's character. The brutality of Richard's death confirms that his enemies wanted his downfall to be visible and absolute. It does not, on its own, confirm the monstrous personal reputation that came to define him. And that reputation gets even harder to defend once you look at his face. Using genetic markers extracted from the skeleton, researchers were able to predict Richard's coloring with a high degree of confidence.
The DNA indicated he almost certainly had blue eyes and probably had blonde hair as a child, hair that may well have darkened somewhat with age, which is common. When they compared this genetic prediction to surviving portraits of Richard, the closest match was not the later, more familiar images that show a darker, harsher, more calculating face. It was the earliest surviving portrait, an arched-topped painting held by the Society of Antiquaries in London, created closer to his own lifetime. The image most people carry in their heads today, and even many of the later paintings themselves, drifted further from the genetic truth the longer the Tudor dynasty that replaced him remained in power. Which raises an obvious question. If the exaggerated deformity and the monstrous reputation were not simply accurate description, where did they actually come from?
The answer traces back to a specific book, written by a specific man at a specific political moment. Around 1513, decades after Richard's death, the scholar and statesman Thomas More wrote a work titled The History of King Richard III. More was writing during the reign of Henry VIII, grandson of the man who had killed Richard at Bosworth and taken his throne. More's account, drawing heavily on testimony from people hostile to Richard, portrayed him as a deformed, ruthless figure who murdered his way to power without conscience. Historians studying More's work have called it a masterwork of persuasion, one that effectively established the enduring myth of the monstrous usurper for the following 4 centuries. Nearly 80 years later, around 1592, William Shakespeare drew on More's account, along with other Tudor-era chroniclers, to write his own play, Richard III. Shakespeare did not simply repeat the existing legend, he sharpened it into something far more theatrical and unforgettable, taking Richard's documented physical difference and turning it into an outward symbol of inner evil, describing him at one point as a poisonous bunch-backed toad. The real Richard had genuine scoliosis. The character Shakespeare built on top of that fact, hunched, limping, withered of arm, was largely invention, shaped to serve a story and to please a dynasty that had every reason to want the man they had overthrown remembered as a monster. None of this happened by accident. The Tudor dynasty's claim to the throne rested on having removed a supposedly illegitimate and evil king. The worse Richard could be made to look in hindsight, the more justified his removal appeared. A curved spine, a real, documented medical condition, became the perfect canvas for that story, because it let the writers turn a physical fact into a moral verdict without ever having to prove one.
And it is here, at the emotional center of this whole excavation, that the deepest reveal comes into focus. Because the same maternal genetic thread that identified this maligned king in a parking lot in Leicester did not end there. It continued forward, unbroken, mother to child, for another 500 years, until it arrived, quietly and without ceremony, inside a furniture maker, living an ordinary life in modern London. There has never been a gap in that particular thread. There has never been a generation where it simply stopped. It survived plague and war and the rise and fall of the very dynasty that tried to erase Richard's name, and it survived doing nothing more dramatic than being passed quietly from mother to child, exactly as it had been passed the generation before and the generation before that. The Y chromosome broke somewhere along the way, a silent, untraceable rupture in a line everyone assumed was solid. But the mitochondrial thread never did. It is still moving forward today, inside someone who almost certainly never thought of himself as carrying a king inside his own cells.
So where does all of this leave the reputation that took root 400 years ago? The DNA and the forensic evidence taken together support a clear and direct conclusion. The monstrous, deformed villain most people picture is substantially a political construction, assembled after the fact by writers working for or within a regime that needed him to look that way, and then sharpened for the stage into something even more extreme than the original propaganda. But that conclusion comes with a necessary correction, because it would be just as much of a distortion to swing entirely in the other direction. The scoliosis was real. The violence of his death was real. 11 wounds, most to an unprotected head, is not a peaceful ending by any measure. The post-mortem humiliation of his body was real. None of the genetic or forensic evidence erases the fact that Richard III lived and ruled during one of the most brutal periods of English political history, or that his own path to the crown involved real and serious controversy that DNA cannot settle one way or the other. What the science dismantles is the caricature. It does not deliver an acquittal. Picture that parking lot again.
Ordinary cars parked over ordinary painted lines, giving no outward hint of what was resting beneath it for over 5 centuries. That is essentially what happened to the truth about the man buried there. An ordinary surface, built up over generations, sat quietly on top of something far more complicated than anyone assumed until careful, patient work was willing to dig underneath it. The same is true of the ordinary man in London who never asked to be connected to a king, and yet was carrying that connection the entire time, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. History rarely announces when it has been rewritten for someone else's benefit. It just gets repeated, generation after generation, until repetition starts to look like fact. What we do with that, once we know how easily it can happen, and how long it can last before anyone thinks to dig, is up to us.